Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining for this third and final stewardship short. Today, we're going to look at how the story that we tell is much greater than the statistics that we may read around stewardship. So let's dive on in and give you our agenda. So I'm going to introduce the topic a little bit. We'll look at some data, some statistics that are out for church giving right now, and then we'll spend most of our time on how we respond to that. What do we do? And we'll end with an invitation and some conversation. So, of course, we always begin these sessions thinking about Jesus and what Jesus would do. We live in a time of great change and challenge for the church. I will not try to sugarcoat that, and I imagine that's part of why you are here, for ideas and support as you consider the right stewardship moves for your congregation. But before we get into that, let's look to Jesus as our way forward. So what would Jesus do as we think about story is greater than statistics? And here you see a familiar passage from Mark chapter 12. Jesus sat down across from the temple treasury and watched how people gave. He didn't commission a giving study or analyze demographic trends. He noticed one person, what she was doing, one unnamed widow, and told her story. Jesus understood something that all of us, especially as we focus on stewardship, need to understand, and that's the power of a story. So we know what Jesus did. He told stories. Lots of parables are in the Bible, right? What about your church? As you think about financial stewardship specifically, what would your church do, especially if giving trends are declining? For most of us, the answer is our church would ask for money more often. We would share giving trends in the bulletin, and we would make sure people know that we have a deficit. We would communicate about the decline, and we would ask people to give more to help make up for it. And there's nothing wrong with being financially transparent. That's really, really important. Although MOFA will always tell you, don't put giving trends in your bulletin. That's a topic for later. But that usually doesn't motivate people to give more. But if we are following Jesus' example, we also need to be telling stories. So if your giving is declining, I think an obvious question that you might be asking is, what are we doing wrong? And when I say giving is declining, I'm talking about financial stewardship, but also time and talent. Less people are volunteering. And so that can oftentimes lead church leaders to say, what are we doing wrong? I will suggest that question is not the right question. That question might be the problem, because declining giving is not primarily a church issue. It's a cultural and generational shift that no wonderful stewardship focus is going to reverse. But the data also shows us that churches who know what they believe, stewardship belief statement, what they exist to do, mission, and who tell that story are navigating this moment in time a lot better than those who aren't focusing on those things. So again, in our first session, we talked about what do you believe about stewardship. Last week, we asked, what does your church exist to do? So today, we're going to look at how you can communicate both of those things through storytelling, which is a way that reaches people who are giving very differently than they used to. So what does the data tell us? And I will preface this by saying I am not a data person. This is not stuff that ever gives me energy, but it's really fascinating to look at current trends and then think about what they mean for our stewardship. So we're going to look at 4 different areas this morning or this afternoon. The first is what's called the giving consolidation dilemma. And then we will look at the generational transitions that are going on in our world. We'll spend some time talking about disaffiliation, and we will also look at the double edge of offering digital giving methods in our churches. But before we dig in, let's go back to Jesus, who told religious leaders, you know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Those, I think, are wise words for us, because the data that we're going to look at isn't cause for panic. It's a sign of the times. And as good stewardship leaders, it's our job to be able to read that data honestly and then respond appropriately. So first area to consider is what's known as giving consolidation. People have not stopped being generous. That's wonderful news. But giving is becoming more concentrated in the United States. fewer people are giving, and those who give are increasingly important to the organizations who are relying on those donations to do their work, right? So the first number I want us to look at is an astounding amount of money. According to Giving USA's latest report, a record $617 billion was given to charity in 2025. So again, good news. There's an incredible amount of money that's being given in the United States on any given year. Second number to look at is the number of gifts of $1,000 or more was up 4.7% in 2025. That comes from a report out of Blackbaud, which offers a lot of different databases that charities use. So they're always surveying about giving. So again, people giving $1,000 or more to an organization, that level increased 4.7%. And then finally, here's another huge number, and this is one that's more relevant to us as church leaders. Giving USA's most recent report also shared that $151 billion, $600 million, it's hard for me to even read that number, went to the religious sector last year. So religious organizations are still getting the biggest piece of that $617 billion pie. But the piece is shrinking when you look year to year. But we're still getting the biggest piece. So cause for some positivity there. So what does this mean for us as stewardship leaders as we look at these numbers and think about giving trends? First thing is it means that we should be asking, how do we retain the people who are already giving? We cannot afford to have an unclear mission or an untold story for the people who are already supporting us, the people who are already in your pews making generous donations on any given Sunday, year after year. So how do we keep those folks retained as givers, to use the technical language? How do we help them see the impact of their giving? That's storytelling. How do we cultivate them? Excuse me, I forgot to advance it. How do we help people see the impact of their giving? That's the storytelling. That's the moments of mission on Sunday morning. That's articles in your bulletins, all the communications that you've got, helping people connect the $20 they put in the plate with some kind of ministry. And we'll talk about some more specific tools you can use to do that later. But that's a question to be asking, as well as, how do we invite people into deeper generosity? A lot of churches that I get to work with are afraid of this question. They're afraid to ask people to go to another level of giving. But there's strategies to take care that are smart and that can lead to folks seeing, hey, I can be more generous. So that's a question to consider. How do we invite folks to give a little bit more? So let's look at our next area as we think about data, and that's the generational transition that's going on. Again, good news is that generosity is not disappearing, but generations give very differently. And the sort of institutional relationships that we could so count on in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s even, is very different now. You hear it often, I'm sure younger generations don't trust institutions the way people my age growing up did, and folks older than me. So the silent generation, older boomers are the most reliable tithers in most congregations, and those folks are aging out. So it's smart as stewardship leaders to be thinking about all generations who are in your congregation and what their giving trends are, and what kind of messaging is helpful for them to invite them to give. So let's look at some numbers. 18% more. 18% more what? According to Giving USA, which is a reliable source of data for charitable giving, their latest report, which is based off 2025, millennials, those are folks ages 30 to 45, gave 18% more than Gen X, that's my generation, those who are 46 to 61 in 2024. So this is the first time ever that a younger generation has given more charitably than a generation ahead of them. So this is big. I think millennials get a bad rap, and the younger folks are thought of as not giving, but they are giving. And so these numbers are important, especially if you're in a congregation where you're countering that kind of messaging about, well, the young people don't give. They do, they just give differently. And it's worth attention and conversation to make sure they're invited into generosity within your church. Second number, 130% increase, 31% decrease. So this is astounding. Millennials giving to faith-based organizations grew 130%. from 2016 to 2022, while their giving specifically to places of worship decreased 31%. So they gave to faith-based organizations. So Laurel Ridge would land in that category, right? Sunnyside Ministries. So things that are faith associated with a denomination. They gave, that increase was 130% over a 5-year period. But then you see that big decline to churches. Again, it's about that institutional component there. But also I think that our churches don't tell our stories well, right? Like that's why we're here, is to learn how we can do a better job of inviting folks to see the impact of their stewardship in our congregation. So final point here for this generational transition is 21 versus 9%. So 21% of Gen Zers, that's folks 18 to 29 for giving studies. Gen Z is actually younger than 18, but when we're doing charitable studies, we're just looking at people who are adults. So Gen Z here, 18 to 29, 29% of those folks said that they plan to increase their giving in 2026 to their places of worship. So that's really good news. They're planning on giving more to their church. Only 9% of boomers said that. Boomers are 62 to 80 years old. You could argue, well, that's because boomers are already giving a lot. They're all in. They're dedicated to giving to the church. But still, interesting that only 9% said they would give more versus that big amount of kids or young people who are 18 to 29 who said that 21% said they plan to give more. So I think this is really interesting data. What does it mean for us as stewardship leaders? First is stop assuming that younger generations are less generous. Millennials and Gen Z are giving. The question isn't to ask, how do we get them to give to our church? Instead, it's how do we help younger people see this church as a meaningful place to support, whether that's with their time, their talent, or their treasure. So again, if you're in a meeting with folks at your church and that question comes up, well, how do we get the younger people to give? You can be the voice to say, that's not the question we should be asking. How do we help younger people see this church as a meaningful place for them to support? That ties back to having a stewardship belief statement and a living mission and telling good stories. Second thing to consider, how is your church's mission visible within the congregation? It should be as visible, if not more visible, than your budget. So think back, that 130% increase in millennials giving to faith-based organizations tells us that faith is not the issue, but perhaps the institution is. So change the story that you're telling and get really specific and make that mission visible. Something so simple as during the offering, being able to say your tithes and offerings are providing places of belonging. They are feeding people in our neighborhood who are hungry. They're supporting shared ministries like Laurel Ridge or Camp Hope or Mount Morris, right? So just making sure that people see that the tithe and the offering is connected to something that's bigger than them that they want to support. And I just realized, I'm sorry, my bullets today are not keeping up with my words. Giving people something specific to say yes to is the point I just made. All right, so let's look at number 3, the disaffiliation factor. I'm sure you've seen the research, Pew Research Center is a really good source if you're ever looking for church data. They've put out a lot of articles and studies about how there's the increase in the number of people who have no religious affiliation, the nuns, as what they're known as well as the decrease in the number of people who say that they are Christian. So let's look at some more numbers from Pew. 29% of American adults in 2025 are religiously unaffiliated. 35% of Gen Z adults, again, that's your 18 to 29-year-olds, 35% said that they were religiously unaffiliated. And then 41% of Americans gave to a religious organization last year, which is a decrease from 62% 20 years ago. So these numbers, you might say, gosh, that's really discouraging. We got a third of our American adults who are not affiliated with a religion. We got 35% of this generation of 18 to 29-year-olds who aren't. And we got 41% of Americans who give to a religious organization, but that's a significant drop. But while you might be discouraged by this, do not be paralyzed by it. There's also data to support taking action and what we can do to help in this space. So what are those? First, connect with your community. There's data that shows that congregations that have strong community ties have higher giving and they're experiencing growth. So these churches have visible community mission, and that's something that people want to give to. So make sure you are telling the stories of how your ministry is in the community making a difference. Second, there's research that also shows that spiritually vital congregations are more likely to be outward facing. So there's a group called Faith Communities Today, also known as FACT, and their most recent data set had over 15,000 congregations in it, 80 different denominations represented. It found that churches that saw themselves as vital had a broad array of outreach ministries. They were doing things beyond their own walls. The vitality is bigger than attendance. We tend to use Sunday worship numbers as a metric, how many people came, and that is important, it matters. But churches that are experiencing greater giving and growth are the ones that are able to say, we've got mission and outward focus. We're in the community trying to make a difference. And that's something that you need to be paying attention to as well. Finally, research shows that churches that are adaptable, that are willing to change, also see higher levels of giving. The study can't say for sure if you're open to change, that means your giving will increase. But congregations reporting who see themselves as innovative, responsive to their changing neighborhoods or the environments, reported higher levels of giving than those that saw themselves as being resistant to change or were trying to keep things the way they've always been. So again, an openness to change is something that congregations that are seeing greater giving, that's how they see themselves. So we know that stewardship is not just about managing money, right? It's also faithfully adapting ministry so that they continue to serve the people who are in need of them, and so that people continue to see a reason to invest in them. So consider at your church community connections, vitality, and openness to change. Are we outward facing, inward facing? Are we stuck trying to preserve everything from the past? Are we willing to adapt? These are important conversations for leaders to be having. And finally, as stewardship leaders, are we willing to change by moving away from this question? I hear it every time I meet with a church. How do we get people to give? How do we get people to give more? And it's a question that I would say is not as important as what kind of church inspires people to want to give. So think for a minute about that. Think about meetings that you're in. Is the question, how do we get people to give? Or is it what kind of church inspires people to want to give? I would say that the second one is more important than the first one. All right. Let's move into our fourth area, which is the digital giving double edge. What does that mean? Research shows that churches that offer online and text giving see an increase in the number of gifts that they receive. Which is good news. A 2024 ministry brand study found that churches who were offering multiple digital giving options were nearly twice as likely to report increased giving than those who offered only one or more. What do I mean by multiple digital giving options? I mean, you can go online on the church website, click a link, make a gift. I mean, text to give. I mean, you've got a QR code printed in your bulletin that takes someone to be able to give. So multiple ways for people to engage digitally with giving. Those churches are nearly twice as likely to report an increase in giving than the ones who don't have multiple methods. Also, that same ministry brands study found that 34% of online giving dollars came through recurring gifts. Why does this matter? Because recurring givers give more than occasional givers. So Vanco, which is a company that offers church online giving and a lot of other different resources for churches, found in their most recent study of 25,000 churches that recurring givers gave almost twice as much annually as occasional givers. So I think that's really interesting and a great case for why churches should be encouraging people to set up those recurring gifts that are processed automatically. But while we have all this data about giving patterns and behaviors and online giving and all the different ways there, we don't have a lot of evidence about how or whether digital giving is impacting steward formation. And that's the double edge. What does it mean for us as stewardship leaders? So we have to be even more intentional about our offertories, our storytelling, and how we say thank you for gifts. We can't just rely on that automatic email that's generated as soon as somebody clicks give. I often hear in conversations with churches that have a lot of digital giving going on. Well, how are kids learning about giving if they don't see mom and dad putting money in the offering plate like they used to, right? That's a great question to be thinking about. So again, there's a double edge to the convenience of digital giving. And there's reasons to promote digital giving, but also just to be aware of what are we doing to form stewards, even as giving may be happening on a Wednesday night and not on a Sunday morning as it always used to. So what is our response to all of this data, numbers that might be discouraging, numbers that might be encouraging? And as we think about this focus that we have on storytelling over statistics, what do we do? Wishing things were different and how they were several years ago, it doesn't help. So what steps should we be taking to lead wisely in this particular moment in the life of the church? And we've touched on a few of these over the past 3 weeks together, but want to look at them again and then add a new one to the mix. So first thing that we're going to do as wise stewardship leaders is to lead with belief. What does that mean? That means clarify the theology around stewardship and then communicate it. So if you use that word at church, people understand what it means. Churches that lead with a stewardship belief statement give people that might be questioning, skeptical even, I don't trust the church. You're giving them a consistent, compelling reason to be generous because it's grounded in theology. It's in the Bible. So your belief statement is articulating those things like we believe God is, we believe we are called to, we believe stewardship includes, and we believe generosity flows from. So those kinds of statements form their own story, and that story is a lot more powerful than just asking somebody to give. So first step is leading with belief. Second is telling mission stories year round. Make that commitment that this is going to be something that we do all year in 2027, although I tell you to go ahead and start. But again, thinking about scripture, Luke chapter 15, when Jesus wanted to explain what God is like, what the kingdom of God is about, he told a story. And he told a specific story about specific people, one father, two sons. He knew the power in telling stories about real people that his listeners could relate to, see themselves in those people choose, right? Jesus knew how to help people understand this is what somebody was facing. This is what changed because of the ministry that happened, and here's why this matters. So our stories should be doing the same thing. In worship, in communications, as you tell mission stories year round, you're naturally forming stewards year round. And then finally, use a narrative budget. So as you think about giving consolidation, disaffiliation, generational differences, digital giving double edge, you're probably wondering, gosh, is there like one thing that we could do that would help with all of these 4 areas? And I think it's a narrative budget. So if you're not familiar with those, they translate your financial budget and data into a mission. There's stories instead of line items. Narrative budgets make the case for what dollars are actually doing, how money becomes ministry. They help answer the question that many people are asking, which is, what does my gift to this church actually do? There's all kinds of data, I didn't put it in here, around how people's brains better receive and understand stories. They retain them more than numbers. And so you've got folks sitting out there that are ready to hear stories that are what your budget is enabling the church to accomplish. So let's look more specifically about why a narrative budget is the right tool in this declining giving environment that we're in. First thing is, it speaks a language that people understand. I can't tell you how many times I've heard folks say, well, I'm not a numbers person. I don't speak budget. And so at church council, typically churches are presenting a line item budget or maybe just a version of that. What are the stories that you can be telling that narrate that budget? That's a language that more people are going to understand, and it's going to motivate them and inspire them. So make sure that you are speaking a language people understand. Also, make your mission visible. We talked about this already. How do you give those mission moments? It's not just that we print our mission statement in the bulletin, but make it come alive so that, again, if people understand my gift of $20 in the offering plate today is helping our church do what out in the community and help us achieve our mission. Thirdly, really feel like there's a delay as I click on this to get the bullet points to come up. I apologize. You're going to change how you ask from institutional to missional. Again, that's we need money to pay the church bills. That's an institutional ask. Or we've got a shortage and we're unable to do X or Y. That's about the church needing the money. The missional ask is about the ministry that's happening. So you need the money to pay your pastor, sure, but what is the pastor's missional role? So that money is helping the worship experience come alive, pastoral counseling, all those different things. So narrative budget helps shift you from the institutional side of the ask to the missional ask. And then finally, a narrative budget shows people what their generosity makes possible. So let's look at an example. You can better understand what I mean. So on the left, you see, here's our line item budget, and this is a very, very, very simplified version. We've got 45% going to salaries, 30% facilities, et cetera, et cetera. But on the right is the narrative version of that. It's telling the story behind what those numbers mean, helping people see this is what our collective stewardship is accomplishing. So my gift to Ex-Moravian Church, joined with everyone else's gifts, enables us to participate in God's work of transforming lives, serving our neighbors, gathering in worship, and equipping for missions. So this is a story that's worth telling, I think. Narrative budgets take work to put together, and MMFA is absolutely happy to help you with that. There's actually a class that one of our partners, Discipleship Ministries, offers. It's a couple of videos that you watch online, and then they give you the tools where you can start developing your own narrative budget. I can let you know of Moravian folks who have taken the class and done that. So if you want a reference to know whether it's worth your time and the effort, we've got some Moravians here in the Southern Province, especially who've done that in the last few years. But again, these are tools that make this line item budget come alive. So if you look at your line item budget and you see we've got $400 for the electric bill this month, what's the narrative of that? Well, the lights are on so that kids can have Sunday school. The lights are on so that we can have an AA meeting in the fellowship hall. The lights are on for our community meal for those that are hungry and come in our doors to eat. So there's a way you can tell the story of that line item dollar amount that's much more powerful than folks just seeing it, again, on a regular budget spreadsheet as they're typically presented. So this is, again, a way to think about a narrative budget is it's a way to ask, what is each of these line items accomplishing in a person's life or in our community? So if you're able to start looking at your budget that way, that's great. If you can't do that, if you look at line items and say, we can't speak to how this is accomplishing something in someone's life or in our community, then you've got a good place to start digging in and doing a little bit of work. We can share examples of all kinds of narrative budgets with you because we work with a lot of churches over the years on them. So I'd be happy to share some samples with you if that would help. All right, so what is our invitation in this time of story greater than statistics? Again, we'll go back to some familiar scripture. Don't let those statistics get in the way of telling wonderful stories. When your church is telling the story of what God is doing, both within your walls and in your community, you're reaching people as Jesus reached them. You're teaching, you're motivating, and you're inspiring. And so we will always remember Jesus as a storyteller. Our churches should be telling stories as well. So let's pull it all together. Declining giving trends. We've looked at some numbers today. They are real, but they are not the whole story. Churches that will navigate this season well are not the ones with all the QR codes in the world, although those are of value. You could spend a lot of money on and energy on a 1-month stewardship focus this fall, and I don't think that that's going to get you the results that really are what you're looking for. The churches who know what they believe about stewardship, who know what they exist to do, know that mission and purpose of the congregation, and tell that story so compellingly that you get people to feel privileged to be a part of it. Those are the churches that are going to navigate this time well. These 3 sessions, my hope is that they gave you a foundation for starting. It's a lot to do. You can't do all 3 things at once, but hopefully these have given you a place to have conversation about where your church would like to start. I think Jesus gives us the course to follow, the model to follow. He was a model steward. And MMFA is always going to give you partnership. We're going to give you accompaniment for this work. And it is work, and it's hard work. It takes time. But it's worthy, it's necessary, and it's work that God's already a part of. We just have to join in. So hope that you will, hope that you'll let MMFA help. And now I'm going to stop recording or ask Hannah to stop recording so that we can have some time of conversation. So let me stop my